The Chinese Communist Party is writing its own rule book and playing by its own set of rules that do not conform to international norms. This is the greatest challenge of our time.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Every day we hear about the Chinese Communist Party's efforts at global domination. This week it is my pleasure to bring to you a woman powerhouse who is countering the Chinese threat. Bonnie Glick is the director of the new Center for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. Thank you so much for joining me on Global Perspectives.
Ellie, it is my pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, your biography is so impressive. I'd love to share for our audience a bit about you before we get into the work that you're doing right now. You have served in government in incredible positions. You speak 7 languages. And for the Trump administration, you were the Deputy Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development. I'd love to hear, Bonnie, a little bit for our audience, what your priorities were at USAID.
Ellie, thanks for the question. I was able to take the time at USAID to really focus on the priorities of the United States as it relates to developing countries around the world. We serve in 100 different countries in aid missions that are designed to bring development and humanitarian assistance to people who are less fortunate than we are here in America. And so the areas of focus for us in terms of economic development were a focus on women's economic empowerment and on digital technology. These were 2 areas that kind of were a sweet spot for me when it comes to economic growth and economic development. I come from a technology background. We launched a strategy called Digital Development. And
so, Bonnie, and I definitely want to hear more about digital development, but before we move on to that, you also spoke about the work that you did at USAID and through the generosity of the American taxpayer, this $20 billion budget that you had for advancing women. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about that before we move on.
Sure. This was a priority for the Trump administration, and it was driven really by Ivanka Trump, who focused on women's global development. And she called it the Women's Global Development Program, WGDP. So it had a good economic acronym associated with it. And through WGDP, and as it continues to this day, the efforts that have been undertaken by USAID to advance the role of women in local economies are really important. You can't have a successful country, you can't have a successful economy if 50% of the population is left out. So that's what we focused on, was bringing women to the table for economic development.
And I think it's a story that is not told often enough. In fact, like you just said, the prioritization that the Trump administration brought to women's issues, Ivanka Trump's personal care and involvement in the issue, and how wonderful that we had a woman like yourself spearheading this at USAID. So I just want to ask you, what do you think the impact was of that effort?
So it was kind of a two-pronged effort where it was both the financing piece as well as the how do you do this better piece, and a lot of shared experiences across women's communities that are focusing on the same crop areas. One of the things, Ellie, that might be interesting to your viewers is a lot of the technology that we deployed, particularly in Africa, came from Israel. The United States, while I do continue to maintain we are the most generous country, we also are very smart in the way that we approach economic growth. And we partner with allies. And Israel, as you know, has some of the most cutting-edge technology as it relates to agriculture anywhere in the world, for water, for agricultural growth, for artificial intelligence deployed as a solution to get more productive land. So I thought that might be of particular interest to your viewers.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it's also another little known story. Not only that Israel is so advanced in their agricultural tech, but also the relationship they have to African countries and how they've brought this technology over. And so it's wonderful for me to hear that this is actually a trilateral relationship between the United States, Israel, and Africa. And so, Bonnie, moving on from there, you mentioned earlier about the digital aspect of your work. And in fact, in The Hill, you wrote about our American efforts at sharing technology with the third world, but also the Chinese Communist Party. Maybe you could flesh that out for us. What is it that you think the United States should be doing more of, and why should we care what the CCP is doing on this front?
Ellie, this is the greatest challenge of our time. And I don't say that lightly. When you think about, and this isn't just for developing countries, this relates to us here in the United States as much as it relates to countries all over the world. When you look at what's happening now in our technology landscape, we're increasingly seeing that the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, the Chinese economy, which are all kind of one unit, are becoming increasingly intertwined in our day-to-day lives. And I think it's important to elevate that to people's attention, because we've been having some interesting kitchen table conversations in my house. And I think that people all across the country and really all around the world have been having these same kinds of kitchen table conversations. How often have you found yourself having conversations about, for example, supply chain shortages, or about semiconductors, the chip shortages, and how it's hard to find appliances or cars available in the marketplace?
Yeah, it's you know what, I have to tell you that we actually do have these conversations at home. And much of it for our family started with the Wuhan virus, the coronavirus, whatever you want to call it. And at that point, I think personally in my family, we became very aware of the role that China was playing in our lives directly.
Well, that's exactly true. These are the kitchen table conversations that I believe Americans and people all over the world are having now. And so whether it relates to the Chinese Communist Party's promises that it has made to developing countries like Uganda, for example, where the CCP entered into a loan arrangement with the government of Uganda to rebuild and turn into a 21st century the country's only international airport, Entebbe Airport. And the government of Uganda took out a loan for $200 million with the CCP. And maybe they didn't read the fine print in the contract, but based on the government's inability to repay the loan, which was supposed to stretch, they thought, over 27 years, but really has come due now, and the Chinese Communist Party is calling in its note to the Ugandan government, the Chinese are going to take over management of Uganda's only international airport. And this is a story that we've seen repeated over and over around the world. In Sri Lanka, the CCP has taken over the country's largest port. Same is true in the teeny African country of Djibouti. What does that do? Having an airport in Central Africa, having a port in the Indian Ocean, having a port in East Africa, All of these are dual use capability areas that allow the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army of China to be able to stage military operations. These are things that are real, not just threats to the national treasure of the countries that are impacted, but they're actually threats to our national security.
Yeah, absolutely, Bonnie. And this is part of the reason why I'm so thrilled to have you on, because I don't think that Americans understand how the Chinese are actually, mortgaging third world countries in this way, all in the effort to take over the real estate, as you're pointing out, which all have security consequences. And Bonnie, in an op-ed in The Hill, you also wrote about the CCP's technology development, and specifically, I believe, about 5G. In the op-ed, you say, quote, "The CCP's distribution of this technology to developing nations could be a human rights catastrophe on a global scale." Now, that is very strong language. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more to our audience, why are you using this kind of language, and why is this 5G technology so important?
The question about human rights is the critical question, because what is 5G technology? 5G is an enabler for systems. And one of the things that we have seen coming out of the People's Republic of China is an undertaking of both data transmission as well as cameras and surveillance. And what has been banned in the United States by the Trump administration was not just Huawei, but also a company called Hikvision, which is a company that is used by the CCP throughout China, but particularly in Western China, in Xinjiang province, where the CCP has surveillance cameras set up throughout the area to spy on the Uyghur Muslim population. And 5G enables the transmission of the data off of those cameras to be used in terms of facial recognition, to be used in terms of surveillance of chats, surveillance of emails, surveillance of phone calls. And it's all enabled through the nefarious use of 5G technology. In a country like the CCP, which doesn't care about human rights, it actually markets this capability, the package of surveillance plus 5G data upload capabilities, to dictatorships around the world. So we see it, for example, as far away as Venezuela, where the Chinese are exporting their Hikvision cameras and their surveillance technologies so that the Maduro regime in Venezuela can subjugate its population. We're seeing it in authoritarian regimes around the world, but it's also a selling point that Chinese diplomats around the world use when talking to authoritarian governments about ways that they can control their own populations. This is a very serious problem, and as you can see, it has the potential for human rights violations on a grand scale.
So, Bonnie, if Western countries and other developed countries were to adopt Chinese 5G, if they allow the Chinese Communist Party to I guess, sell them the 5G technology and own the 5G networks in their countries, in essence, what they're doing is paving the way for the CCP to be able to survey and monitor all of us, no matter where we live.
It's actually a little bit even deeper than that, Ellie. When you think about what the capabilities are that are built into Huawei's systems, we called it a Trojan horse capability. And when you think about Troy and how the Trojan horse had soldiers inside, it was a wooden structure, but there were bad things that were hidden inside. The same is true with China's 5G technology, so that consider the Venezuela example again. Maduro is spying on his own people, but guess what? China has access to all of that data as well. So not only is it being uploaded to, dens of iniquity in Caracas, Venezuela, it's also being uploaded to Beijing and to surveillance centers that the Chinese Communist Party has set up.
Well, and Bonnie, you're someone who not only identifies the problem, but you're working on the solution. Today, you are the director of the Center for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University, which is America's first think tank at the intersection of technology and U.S. foreign policy. So tell us, Bonnie, what are you doing at the Center for Tech Diplomacy to counter the Chinese threat? And I know you're doing a lot.
I like to call us the country's first tech tank. We have a twofold mission. The first is to advise policymakers, as well as the public, about tech issues as they relate to the U.S. position as the leader of tech advancements in the free world. But it's also to push for diplomatic engagement with our allies and to counter adversaries through discussions about technology. And we do this through the traditional think tank way of writing papers and articles, reports, conducting studies. But we're also trying to introduce training into the mix. And that's where I look at the affiliation that we have with Purdue and say, hey, this organization and its affiliation with Purdue is game changing. Purdue University is one of the great engineering and technology powerhouse universities in the United States. So having a tech powerhouse partnering with us to offer training workshops is, like I said, it's a game changer in Washington, D.C. We're trying to make it simple and help our policymakers and lawmakers understand why it's critical to advance America's national diplomatic interests.
Bonnie, it's really mind-blowing to me because I think all of us are aware that we're living in a techno world. And yet your center is the first one that's really dealing with the advance of technology and how our government needs to understand it, and certainly helping our global partners to understand it. So kudos to you and to everyone there who's making this happen. I'd love to talk a little bit more about what the center would like to see the government of the United States, whether it's this present administration or future administrations. What are the policies that you'd like to see us accomplish?
So one of our goals is to make it easy for the people who are in leadership positions to make technology-based solutions, to understand technology-based solutions and how they impact the United States. Most people who are in government, who serve in the diplomatic and national security world, are not engineers. Most of them come from social sciences, liberal arts, legal, those kinds of backgrounds. It's rare that you find somebody who's a chemical engineer. And yet, we need those engineers and technologists in order to help us understand technology today. The problem is that our level of understanding has kind of remained static over the course of time. We tap out at calculus and don't learn much beyond that unless we're going into engineering. But meanwhile, the level of understanding and engineering complexity in the world of technology has increased hundreds-fold, and we have remained static.
The more I hear you describe the work that the center is doing, the more I understand how important it is. Bonnie, I want to ask you just a couple of more questions because I know we're running out of time. I'm pretty confident, and I think that anyone who is tracking the news knows that the Chinese Communist Party does have ambitions of global hegemony. So my question to you is, if we're in this kind of a race between the United States and the CCP, how is the U.S. doing?
So there's a tendency in policy circles to refer to this as a great power competition. I take issue with that. A competition implies that you're playing the same game by the same set of rules. And we are not. The Chinese Communist Party is writing its own rule book and playing by its own set of rules that do not conform to international norms. And that's reality. So when we're not playing the same game, it's easier for us to acknowledge that we need to take aggressive action in order to maintain and promote our positions, our morals-based positions around the world. And so people throw up their hands and say, oh, China is winning. China is not winning. When you look at the way that China exerts its power around the world, the way that it abuses its own people, it is committing genocide against its own population. These are the things that are starting to weigh on governments around the world. People are realizing it's not a competition because we're not playing by the same set of rules. We are a values-based democracy, and we're promoting development and economic growth. China is an authoritarian dictatorship, and it is promoting genocide. Now, you look at things like the Olympic Games hosted by Beijing, and you have to wonder, how is it that countries that are morals-based are continuing to engage in the Olympic Games? And I understand full well that athletes have committed their entire lives to prepare for Olympic competition. And in no way do I want to undercut athletes. But if we, the United States and our allies, are values-based countries, democracies or otherwise, we should not be supporting Beijing's Olympic Games, and our corporations should not be sponsoring them.
Bonnie, I'm so glad that you brought up the Beijing Games because I am with you. I think the obvious right and moral thing to do is to boycott the Genocide Olympics. And so I can only hope that our audience and truly everyone out there, all Americans, will really push aggressively for that. And so, Bonnie, my last question to you, knowing that the United States is a morals and values-based country, are you optimistic that we can win out this unfair competition against the CCP?
Ellie, I am bullish on the United States and I am bullish on our allies. In no way do I think that the cause of democracy and economic growth and development and human rights is a lost cause. This is something that is the foundation of who we are as a nation. It's what we project around the world. It's what we in the Center for Tech Diplomacy have as our mantra. Technology must advance freedom. And I believe that across all aspects of our society, our allies' societies. And this is not a game. We're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about the future of the world. But I do believe that the future of the world is bright, and it is something that we should all be bullish on.
Well, Bonnie, I am so appreciative of you, everything that you're doing on a daily basis to fight back against what I think is the evil of the CCP and the surveillance, oppressive, and human rights abusing state that they are. So with that, I am just so happy to hear your optimistic views for us going forward. And thank you so much for joining me on Global Perspectives.
Ellie, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for bringing these issues to light so clearly.